Sure. And so was he also studying art?
No, he's an architect.
Oh, wow. Wow. Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
So he got his master's, he got his MS in architecture.
Sure.
You know.
And so, so what was the experience like at Yale? I mean, did that only, I assume, given where you are today, it only solidified, those things that were already inside of you about.
Oh yeah, but it was, it was a huge challenge. It was not a particularly nurturing environment. It was a very challenging environment, and so I was very glad I'd had those kind of formative years to have experience in different ways. But there was a big culture shock to go to the East Coast versus Houston, at that time. Right. And so it was great. Yeah. But it was super challenging. But again, I found myself with a group of super, supportive in their best way, but very challenging professors who, made me think and examine my practice and expand it.
Yeah, I think, I imagine that influences your own methodology in teaching, and that, I think part of us, when we're teaching, we want to be sensitive to someone's fragile emotional state in their creative process. But at the same time, if we do that, we're really not doing them any favors, right? I mean, there's a certain point where you have to be honest, right?
Yeah, but there's a whole spectrum there.
Absolutely. Exactly.
You just kind of condensed into an either or. And it's
not binary.
It's not a binary. It's really like a rheostat. We could turn that rheostat one way or the other. And so I would probably put myself in the more, I'd be interested to hear what my students say, because I do tell them exactly what I think, but I also try to be really aware of where they are developmentally and not attack them as a person ever, or kind of conflate their practice with their person. Right. And so I try to be more sensitive than that.
Right. Sure. So the photography program at Yale, I know that the painting program has the final crit in the pit, which is a bloodbath. Does the photography program have to go through the same sort of final critique that's kind of open to the public, or?
Oh no, and it's interesting. It was I don't know how it is now, because they've moved to a different building across the street from where we were, and. But at the time, it was a very intense, every week was super intense, but it was not a public thing. Right. And in fact, Todd Papageorge was running the program at the time, and he just stepped down. And I was actually in school with a guy who now runs it, who's Greg Crudson. But when we were in school, people would try to attend our crits. Right. And he would say no. So there were a couple people who were like, if they were undergrads and they were taking class, Jennifer Beal, who's a famous actress, used to come and sit in the back and watch. But there were, you could invite somebody like a friend or your partner to come and sit in the crit. But it was a very private, very, very intense event. And it was weekly. And so it was 4 faculty members who would sit like on one side of a table, and then the students would be together and they would be facing each other. Right. But and you'd pin up just an enormous quantity of work every 3 weeks. And they would do the majority of the speaking about the work. And there's usually like the continuing and permanent faculty and then a visiting critic. Right. So... But there wasn't like a big, the way that you're talking about, which architects do that. The final crit at the end of the semester is they, do it in a super public way. Right. They would just have an exhibition. Sure.
Wonderful. So, so once you're out of Yale, how long was it before you guys wound up in this part of the world?
Well, right out of Yale, I took a position in Indiana at the Herron School of Art as a tenure track position. professor.
Right.
And my husband and I moved to Indiana and started our life there. And I was there for, I got tenured and then went on sabbatical. And we had a couple kids.
Right.
And I went on sabbatical with a Fulbright to Mexico. So we went and lived in Mexico for a year and worked at the Universidad de las Americas, which is in Puebla.
Right.
And we quit and came back to Texas from Mexico. I mean, we went back for a semester and, said goodbye and, took care of business. And, but it was a huge shift because my husband was a partner in a firm in Indianapolis and I was tenured. But a position came open at UNT, and it was, they had a grad program, they had great facilities, a lab tech, all that, and closer to home with family. We both had parents who lived in Texas and wanted to be closer to them with our kids and all that. Right. And UNT is a great school, so it was a great opportunity.
That's awesome. Mm-hmm. And so that was what, like 22 years ago? Or something?
Yeah.
Awesome.
So we came mid-year in 1996, January 1996, so 22 years ago.
Okay. And so the projects, I guess your work at that point, at what point did your work get to, some semblance of what we see today? Does that make sense?
Well, I have a kind of a shifting practice all the time. Mm-hmm. So I have it's project based,
right?
And so the physical manifestation of the work changes based on the project. So my technical approach shifts, and my thinking shifts based on the research I'm doing about the topic.
Sure.
So that if you look at my website, there's a shared visual language, but each project is strikingly different, I would say.
Right.
And so when I first came here, I was working on I had been working on a couple of projects in Indianapolis that are not on my website, and then, my Yale portfolio. There's a lot of work that's not on my website. So I started. I think 1998 is maybe some of the work from 1998, that era is in there. And I had been doing still lifes where I was collecting objects from the landscape and then photographing the landscape and then combining them in the studio by projecting the slide onto a still life that was made out of objects.
Yes.
And so it kind of looks...
Yeah, I saw that, and I guess, I guess I was trying to figure out was the final product a photo of that layered image, or is the final product, an installation where it's projected onto that mixed media? Right.
And it's actually the photograph. It could have worked that way, but it was in fact not. It was just a really large scale photograph that came out of that. But and interesting though, because I was trying to get at the complexity of the landscape, that the landscape is not this, not to throw straight photographers under the bus, but just, how do you get at this narrative sense?
Sure.
Or these kind of layers of time and history in any particular landscape.
No, so. I totally get it. As, I oftentimes challenge my students, to think in terms of mixed media and layers of layers of information. Mm-hmm. Okay, if you're going, great. If that's what you want to paint, great. But think about, is there some way you can layer more information on top of there, and it maybe not even be a simple, straightforward statement, but something that somebody gets to discover, because there's something really beautiful about the viewer share in being able to discover things in artwork. It's much more gratifying for the viewer to be able to discover those things, and so I love the mixed media aspect there, and how it's hard to figure out at first exactly what's in the layers. And then, you can start to figure it out with, cast shadows and things. But it's really lovely work.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so how would you describe that thread that goes through that last 18, 20 years of work? Because there seems to be an overarching theme. And how would you describe that overarching theme?
Well, I tend to think of it as being about place and the landscape and the environment, and how our interaction with those places affect, humans' interaction with the landscape, how it affects that landscape. So it kind of goes to resource management or national parks and nature preserves, as macro gardens that are kind of curated and manipulated, to this newest work that I have here where we're meeting at Holly Johnson Gallery, and, looking at the way that the Corps of Engineers, their management of the landscape during that flood allowed the water to stay during the wrong part of the year, 26 feet above flood stage for 3 months. And so the effect that had on the landscape, which is this human action that's taking this landscape that's not really, none of the places are ever wild, even though they may be large tracts of land. They don't have that humans visit but don't necessarily live there. Right. Well, how would you see it? I'm curious, since you picked up on the thread.
Oh, no. Well, I mean, I see it as, it's about place. It's about man's impact on the environment, man's impact in what is our role in the ecosystem. Are we invisible participants in it? Are we guests? Are other parts of nature guests in our domain? And in just I think there are issues around how much are we responsible for what's happened, and how much are we responsible for maintaining life going forward, right? Like what's been our negative impact, and what can we do to counter that, and what forces are at work, right? I see my answer is a lot more wordy than yours, right? Because it's you've spent a lot of time kind of drilling down there versus me, but what so the work that we have here, it looks like I see work from Deluge and work from Triggered. Is that right?
Yeah.
From those two series. And so the Deluge is specific to what we were talking about with the Corps of Engineers and flooding, and your images, you do a couple of different things here. One, it's out in the field, taking a traditional image of the effect of those decisions. But then the other work that you're creating are those hydrographs. Is that a term that you came up with on your own, or is that a literal term?
That's
it's so fitting. But I haven't come across that term before.
Well, a hydrograph is actually a thing, and a hydrograph is like a graph that tracks river heights over time.
Okay.
So it's the height of the river over time, which is exactly what these are. Where my husband and I canoed out into the flood. And we would take these huge sheets of paper, watercolor paper, and clip it to wire strung between trees, so that it was hanging into the flood itself for weeks on end. And as the river height would change, going down primarily because it was at the end when they were starting to let water out, because they were afraid that they would flood Dallas if they That's why it was kept, to protect the city. But as the water started coming down,